A quiet, unremarkable girl takes the stage to play what she couldn't say in words. What started as a mockery turns into a moment no one expected. Every note becomes a challenge to indifference, prejudice, silence. And when the last sound fades, everything at school will never be the same. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. In the school's coordinate system, Lena Marlowe was somewhere between the wall and the shadows. She was not called by name, not touched upon in conversations, not included in lists. Teachers, passing by her desk, seemed to physically feel the resistance that comes with contact with an unknown substance. They slid their gaze, barely touched her with intonation, did not linger in her space. Lena was there, but as if without the right to be noticed. In her backpack, there was always the same lunch, the same tattered notebook and case, not modern, not branded, but old, with scuffs, in which she kept her violin. No one knew where she got this violin from, why she carried it every day, even when there were no music lessons, and strangest of all, why she never played it. Lena lived on the outskirts of the city in an apartment building with peeling walls, where at night you could hear voices, the banging of doors, and the radio playing from dawn until dark. Her mother often disappeared to work, returning exhausted, her eyes tired even before the door opened. They had no conversations, no particular warmth. But one day, many years ago, her mother brought home that very violin and said, "Your grandfather used to have this. He played it when he was alone. He said it made it easier to breathe." Since then, the violin had become the only thing in Lena's life that didn't seem accidental. She didn't study at a music school, but every night, when the walls of their apartment seemed too close, she would take out the instrument and play, timidly, intermittently, and sometimes as if she were trying to play a pain that couldn't fit into a single word. At school, no one was interested in her life. The teachers gave her formal grades, not out of cruelty, but simply because Lena did not interfere, did not argue, did not shine. For them, she was that quiet one, odd, no problems, so everything is fine. Miss Bramwell, the English teacher, a woman with a permanent crease between her eyebrows, who was convinced that children must be active, expressive, grateful, especially disliked her. Lena seemed to her to be something inexplicably irritating, mute, always in her own world, and with that violin, as if she wore a strange protest against the generally accepted. "Lena," she said one day, sorting through her notebooks after class, "will you ever speak up, or are you going to keep quiet until graduation?" Lena looked up, calmly, without challenging, just looked. "I speak when it is necessary." Miss Bramwell snorted. "I think you're just hiding, and life doesn't like the silent." During recess, Miss Bramwell went into the staff room where Mr. Crane, the biology teacher, was drinking coffee at a table. He was one of those who considered himself closer to the children, often joked and liked to tease the students. He was the type of teacher that the teenagers both respected and feared, for his sarcasm and observation. "Do you have Lena Marlowe in your class?" she asked. "Yes, a gray mouse. She carries a violin, but I've never heard her play it." "That's exactly it. I think she has emptiness there instead of strings. Or pills." He chuckled. "I don't rule it out." "But what do you suggest? Search her?" "No." Bramwell considered. "There's a talent show next week. Maybe we should motivate her to go on stage, like gently, through attention. Let her show herself once, or embarrass herself. Either way, she'll shake herself up." Mr. Crane frowned. He didn't like it when teachers crossed the line between pedagogy and meanness, but this time it seemed to him that it might actually be beneficial. "I'll talk to her myself." The next day, after class, he stopped Lena at the exit. "Hey, Marlowe. Wait, we have a talent show coming up soon. My colleagues and I were wondering, maybe you want to perform." She turned. His voice sounded kindly, but she sensed something insincere in it. Perhaps it was the tone that was too broad, the interest too vivid. But she did not flinch. "Play?" she asked. "Well, yes. Since you always carry this instrument, I think you can surprise." Or you can just show what you can do, or what you can't do." He laughed. "In any case, it's interesting." Lena looked at him for a long time, silently. So much so that Mr. Crane felt uncomfortable. "Okay," she said. "Really?" He didn't even expect it. "Yes." "Well, then sign up with Miss Olive, she's the curator, and good luck." "Thank you," she answered briefly and left. He watched her go. There was something strange in her step. Not embarrassment, not awkwardness. Something decisive. He suddenly felt that he had done something more important than he had wanted. But he didn't yet understand where it would lead. In the teacher's room, he said, "Well," she agreed. "Who?" "Lena. To the performance." Miss Bramwell looked up from her magazine. "Really? Ha! Well, hold on. This is going to be a disaster." And Lena walked home that night with the same expression on her face. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel afraid. She just didn't want to be silent anymore. And if all she had was her violin, then she would speak through it. In her hands, its worn metal clasps glinting, the case seemed no longer a protection but an instrument of choice. And she knew, now it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was that she would play. Preparations for the school talent show were going on as usual. Students were rehearsing in the gym and the assembly hall, decorating the stage, drawing posters, learning dances, whispering, making plans, and getting nervous. The predictable preschool chaos was in the air, with everything seething and pulsating, and the adults pretending to be in control. Teachers were writing down names on the lists of performers, pretending to help, although they themselves were barely holding back their fatigue. Everything was as usual. Everything, except one thing. The name of Lena Marlowe appeared suddenly and caused confusion. Miss Olive, who was responsible for coordinating the show, first read the entry 3 times. Her small, condensed handwriting suddenly seemed too noticeable among the other lines. She looked up and, as if to confirm the reality, asked Mr. Crane, "You said Lena Marlowe will be participating?" "Yes," he shrugged. "I suggested it myself. I didn't think he'd agree." "And do you know what she will do?" "Play, I think. The violin, or whatever she has there." He waved his hand. "The main thing is not belly dancing." They both chuckled. But there was already a hint of uncertainty in that laughter. They had a bad feeling, but it was too weak to admit it seriously. The news spread quickly among the students. Some responded with curiosity, others with malice. Chloe Bryn was especially active, arrogant and beautiful, like an advertising poster. She always set the tone in the class and had a great sense of who could be humiliated with impunity. "Marlowe's going to play?" she asked her friend Jess. "Seriously? On what? On nerves?" Laughter. Confident. Catchy. "What if she plays great?" Someone carefully interjected from behind. "If she's acting, then I'm a ballerina from the Bolshoi," Chloe snapped. "Oh, come on. She'll just come, squeak, cry, and run away. I'm already looking forward to it." Lena was walking down the hallway, clutching her books to her chest, when she heard her name being played out in the voices behind her. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She just tightened her fingers on the spine of the book. She knew they were talking about her, but she was used to it. Her name was always spoken with either disdain or bewilderment. And there was loneliness in that, too, the silence in which she lived, alien even to those who tried to get close to her. In class, Miss Bramwell looked at Lena differently now, as if interest had awakened in her, or suspicion. During one of the classes, she suddenly turned to her. "Lena, wouldn't you like to read this passage out loud?" The class froze. Everyone turned around. The girl who was usually ignored was now suddenly in the center. But Lena calmly looked at the text, opened the book, and began to read. Her voice was quiet, but even, clear as a line. Not a single hesitation. Not a single embarrassment. Miss Bramwell nodded. "Thank you. Very expressive." But there was a note of caution in her tone. She didn't like it when someone disturbed her usual picture of the world. After class, Lena approached the door, but was stopped. "Lena," said Miss Bramwell, putting down her magazine, "you're going to perform in the show, aren't you?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what you're going to play?" "No." "Why? It will be a surprise. You know, we have to control the program. We are teachers." Lena held her gaze for a second. "If necessary, you can cross me out." Bramwell pressed her lips together. "Okay, play whatever you want." Lena was sitting in her home that evening. The room was small, not so much a room as a corner, separated from the kitchen by a bookcase. The violin lay on her lap. She held it lightly, like breathing. Her mother was on shift. There was no one else. Only silence. Only she and the music. She didn't know the names. She didn't understand the composers. She played what she felt. From pain, she made a melody. From loneliness, a voice. From fear, strength. Her fingers danced on the strings, and the air was filled with something that couldn't be put into words. Across town, Mr. Crane sat watching television. He was remembering his conversation with Bramwell, and suddenly he felt a strange uneasiness. He had drawn this girl into the game himself. He had thought he would joke around, give her a push. But what if she really couldn't handle it? What if this wasn't a moment of growth, but a moment of collapse? He imagined Lena. Quiet, stubborn. And suddenly he felt ashamed. That evening, the school was rehearsing the lights and sound. Lena didn't come. There were posters on the walls. Discover your talent. Show what you can do. Phrases that didn't make sense to those who weren't believed in the first place. Leah, one of the few quiet girls in the class, noticed Chloe discussing Lena again. Can you imagine? She didn't even show up for the sound check. Maybe she ran away? I hope not. I want to see this failure. And if she plays well? Don't make me laugh. Leah said nothing, but doubt stirred inside her. She didn't know Lena, but something about her seemed real. Not loud, but truthful. And that evening, Lena played again. With her eyes closed, her fingers glided over the fretboard as if searching for a way out of the cramped room. She didn't know how people would react to her, but she knew that when she went on stage, everything she played would be true. Her truth. And then no one will be able to say that she is just a quiet girl with a case. The hall was full. The creaking of chairs, the rustling of programs, whispers, short giggles, the rustling of clothes, all this merged into the rhythm of a school talent show where everyone hoped to either shine or at least not to disgrace themselves. Students took turns on the stage, and each number received its share of applause. Someone rapped, someone danced, someone sang with an uncertain smile, and even if not everything sounded or moved perfectly, the audience, mainly parents, friends, teachers, and classmates, supported as best they could, some with applause, some with polite approval, some with an ironic comment on the phone. Lena sat backstage, at the back of the stage, in her gray sweatshirt, with her cello carefully placed next to her. She was the last on the list, and she knew it from the start. Mr. Crane, who at one point looked backstage, was surprised. Instead of a violin, he saw a cello. But he didn't say a word. He just nodded, and Lena nodded back too, reservedly, confidently. A duet came out on stage before her. Two girls in identical dresses sang a pop song that had high stakes. The teachers nodded along to the beat. Someone clapped. After them, a boy spoke, telling a funny story from life in the style of stand-up. The audience laughed, but Lena wasn't listening. It was as if she was behind glass. Everything that was happening wasn't about her. It was all an outer shell, and she sat as if in the center of a storm, where there was always silence. Having completed his act, the MC, a high school student with a beaming smile and an inflated sense of humor, stepped up to the microphone. "And now, the mystery of the evening," he announced. "The final number is Lena Marlowe." He paused. Yes, the same Lena whom you may have never heard, ever. Well, everyone has a chance. Applause. The clapping was restrained. Some were polite, others were awkward. Some did not clap at all. The audience grew quiet, not out of respect, but out of anticipation. What would this be? A mockery? A curiosity? Silence? Lena walked out on stage, calmly, confidently, without fussing. Someone in the audience chuckled. Someone whispered, "Look, he's dragging a cello. Maybe he'll start yearning for Shostakovich now." But these voices didn't touch her. She heard only her own steps on the stage and the light beating of her heart. She didn't look at the audience. She put the instrument down. She sat down. She tuned the strings. No words, no explanations, just a pause. And the beginning. The first notes were quiet, clear. Lena took her time. She built the sound as if she were laying brick after brick into something tall and embracing. The music was not from a repertoire, it was from within, from nights when there were screams around the walls, from days when no one asked how she was doing, from lessons when she wanted to speak but could not find the right words. She played all of this, and more. Pain, patience, despair, resistance, and the hope that she kept like a flame covered by her palms. At first, there was movement in the hall. Someone was moving, someone was checking their phone, someone was looking closely. But with each new phrase of her performance, the hall froze. Slowly, as if the air had become thicker. Eyes rose from their knees. Lips closed. Breathing slowed. Even those who laughed have stopped understanding how to joke, because it is impossible to laugh at something that speaks to you deeper than words. When Lena reached the climax, her fingers on the strings became like wings. She lifted the music up, made it free, not for the sake of applause, for the sake of saying, "I am here," to be heard, not as a girl with a shadow, but as a voice. The last note was soft. It didn't break off, it dissolved. Lena raised her head, but she didn't stand up. She sat, not expecting anything. She just let the silence be. The hall was silent, almost eerily silent. Then came the applause. Not right away, but when it came, it wasn't just a round of applause. It was recognition. The teachers stood up, even Miss Bramwell. Some stood hesitantly, some quickly, but they stood up. Because at that moment, everyone understood. It doesn't matter how much you spoke, what matters is what you said. Lena stood up, bowed. Her gaze did not dart about, it was even, calm. She did not smile, but her face was shining. She left the stage, leaving behind not applause, but an echo, quiet, dense, deep. The music sounded for a long time in the heads of those who thought they had seen her. But now he knew. He knew nothing. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt not pride, and not relief, but freedom, real, like breathing, like a sound released into the world. The morning after the show, Lena woke up earlier than usual. The light had not yet penetrated the thick curtains, but she was already sitting in silence, on the edge of her bed, her hands resting quietly on her lap. Everything in the apartment was the same: the faded wallpaper, the creaking door, the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, but something had shifted inside her. It was not a magical transformation. There was no sense that life had suddenly become different. No, there was simply a lightness, imperceptible to the eye, but clear in the breath. She felt it in her chest, not as euphoria, but as if someone had finally straightened her shoulders after a long period of heaviness. There was no pride, no excitement. There was silence, a silence filled with meaning. At school, everything was different. The corridors, as always, resembled rivers. Streams of students flowed from classroom to classroom, colliding, splashing, drawn by bells and schedules. But something in these streams had changed. When Lena entered the building, the usual feeling of transparency, that she was not noticed, not heard, not taken into account, disappeared. People turned around, not mockingly, not with pity. Simply, they looked. Some stopped, some whispered. Several people nodded, some smiled. One girl, a junior, whispered as she passed, "You were beautiful when you played yesterday." Lena nodded, again without a smile, but with warmth. The classroom was tensely silent. The first break was short, and usually there was noise, laughter, conversation. Today everything seemed a little quieter. When Lena walked in, the conversations died down. Glances slid to her and back. No one pushed. No one giggled. Even Chloe Breen, accustomed to being the leader in any space, looked down as Lena passed. Not out of fear, out of misunderstanding, out of awkwardness, out of an attempt to cope with her own shame, which had suddenly come alive after a long sleep. The English lesson began in the usual rhythm. Miss Bramwell was dry and collected, as always, but there was something different in her gaze, too. When she saw Lena, she raised her eyebrows slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Halfway through the lesson, leafing through the magazine, she stopped at Lena's name, paused, looked at her, and said, "Lena, you performed strongly yesterday." Lena looked up. The teacher hesitated, then added, "I didn't expect that, thank you." This was perhaps the first thank you said to her within the walls of the school, not for not being in the way, but for being real. After class, Lena found a folded piece of paper lying on her desk. The handwriting was uneven, as if it had been written quickly. Inside were just 2 lines. "You were the best. Sorry I didn't see it." Unsigned. But she didn't need to know who wrote it. That was enough. It was more than an apology. It was a confession. At dinner, Lena, as always, sat by the window, but this time she did not have to eat alone. Leah came up to her, the same girl who had previously remained silent when Lena was laughed at. She brought her tray and sat down next to her without asking. "Hello," she said. "Hello," Lena responded. "You want half of my apple?" "I'm fine. Thank you." They sat in silence. There was no awkwardness, only acceptance. Lena was walking down the hallway that afternoon when Mr. Crane called out to her. He looked as if he had been rehearsing this encounter in his head. "Lena," he began, "I want to say, what you did yesterday, it wasn't just a performance. It was something more. Honestly, I didn't think you could do that. Not because I underestimated you personally, although I guess that's what I did. It's just that sometimes we teachers don't know how to listen." Lena nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for asking me to speak." He froze. "You're not angry?" "A little. But it passed. Because yesterday I was not for you. I was for myself." He nodded, looking down. "Thank you for forgiving me." She didn't answer. She just moved on. The day was ending. The corridors were quieter. Lena packed her backpack and left the building, but she didn't go home right away. She turned toward the school's courtyard, where there were old benches, and sat down. She took out her violin, not to play, just to hold it. She opened the case and ran her fingers over the strings. At the bottom was a note that hadn't been there before. Someone had put it there without a signature. The words were neatly written on it. "Your music changed my silence." Lena pressed her fingers to her lips, not to hold back tears, there were none, but to hold back something else. The feeling that was spreading inside her and which she could not yet name. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a triumph. It wasn't an apology to the world, but it was a beginning. She realized, now she had a voice. And let her not become popular. Let tomorrow someone whisper behind her back again. None of this had the power it once had. She took the violin, stood up, and walked home. The sky above her was transparent. The air was cool and fresh. and each step echoed in her body like a beat. You are. You sound. You are heard. The morning was normal, cool, sleepy, with a cloudy, pale sky and diffused light that seeped through the school windows. The corridors were filled with voices again, movement, the smell of markers and damp clothes, but everything felt different. Something had changed in Lena, and therefore everything had changed. She still walked through the school in silence, still wore her violin on a strap over her shoulder, still sat by the window in the cafeteria. But now her silence was not a barrier. It was a choice. An approved boundary behind which she no longer hid, but in which she lived. Some students gave her a wide berth out of habit, but they did so without mockery. Others, on the contrary, stared longer than they should have. Their looks were a mixture of respect, confusion, and an attempt to understand why someone could be so stoic. One boy, whose name Lena barely knew, approached her after class and said quietly, "I was listening. You played like you had a whole world inside you. I'm sorry I laughed before. I didn't know you were real." She looked at him with a small smile. She wasn't surprised that he apologized. She was surprised that it was real. In class, the teachers began to address her more often, not because they wanted her to participate, but because they finally saw that she existed. Even Miss Bramwell, who usually kept her distance, now nodded to Lena with cautious goodwill, and for the first time praised her for her essay. Simply and calmly, without unnecessary words. Lena accepted this as something that had long been coming, but she did not take a mental exam for forgiveness. She did not take offense. But she did not try to seem grateful for finally being noticed, because, as she now understood, she had never disappeared. One day, a few days after the show, a note appeared in her locker drawer. No name. Paper, neatly folded in half. Inside, just one sentence. You taught me to be silent in a different way. No signature, no explanation. But Lena felt it was important. Maybe for someone else who also lived in the shadows, who might not be anymore. She started playing more at home, not only at night but also during the day, sometimes with the window open. Mom noticed this and stopped what she was doing in the kitchen to listen. Then one evening, without turning around, she said, "It's like you've become louder, Lena, even when you're silent." Lena looked down. It was one of the warmest confessions she had ever received from her mother. Not a loud "proud of you," not a loud "you're the best," just a quiet remark, and that was enough. Gradually, music became not only her voice, but also her bridge. Several times during breaks, girls approached her, asking if she still played. One of them even asked, "Can you teach me a few notes?" Lena nodded. And in their movements, when they sat next to each other on the steps, when she handed the violin to the girl, when she explained how to press the string, there was something that had not existed in her school days: acceptance. Even Chloe Bryn, whose arrogance had once been armor and was now slowly crumbling, stopped Lena in the hallway once. It was a brief encounter. Awkward. Chloe's gaze was off to the side, her voice was slightly broken. "I was not so good," she muttered. Then, before that. Lena didn't answer. She just looked, not judging, not smiling, just letting him know. She heard. Chloe nodded and left. None of this made Lena a star. She didn't become the most popular. No one carried her photos on their phones, didn't post them on social networks, didn't proclaim her heroine of the week. But she became herself, real, clear, free from the need to justify herself. One day, Mr. Crane stopped Lena at the exit of the classroom and suggested to her, "We want to have an evening of live music, in a small auditorium, informal, a few students, teachers, parents. Would you like to perform?" Lena thought about it. She had already proven what she wanted. She owed nothing to anyone. But something deep in her chest responded, not a debt, but a desire. Not a need to prove, but a desire to share. "Okay," she replied. Few people came to the evening. A small hall. A few teachers, a couple of parents, 3 students. Lena came out without announcement. She just sat down and played. Not like that day at the show, not furiously, not with pain, but softly, calmly. Music, like the breath of spring, like the sound of acceptance. After her performance, she did not expect a standing ovation, but a woman approached her, a parent of one of the girls. Her eyes were red. "Thank you. You don't just play. You heal." Lena nodded. She didn't know how to respond to that, but inside she felt like she was doing something important. And even if the crowd didn't know it, those around her did. And most importantly, she knew it herself. A week later, she was sitting by the window in the dining room again, alone, but now by choice. In her hands, a sketchbook in which she drew music from time to time, in the form of lines, waves, simple figures. Leah came up. Without asking, she sat down next to her. And in the silence, as in a confident chord, she simply shared a moment with her. "You know," she said, "I used to think that silence was when you have nothing to say. But now I understand. It's when you don't want to speak in vain." Lena nodded slightly. Music is also silence, but with a voice. And that was the answer. In the evening, she left school and walked slowly along the alley. In her backpack was a violin. In her pocket was a note, left anonymously. "You taught me to hear, even myself." And perhaps this was her main performance, not on stage, but in every step after it. There was silence inside her, not empty, but full. Like a pause between 2 parts of one important symphony. Life was just beginning, and it was hers.